You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome back, guests. We hope you had a relaxing holiday and are ready to check back in. It was a quiet time for BC politics. So we're going to shut down the strategy suite this week, give it some renovations. And we're going to head straight to the minibar after our chat with our next guest, who I'm so excited to have on the pod. We're sure you all know him, or at least his column. Welcome to Hotel Pacifico, Vaughn Palmer.
Oh, thanks very much for asking me, Katie. Looking forward to it. Hi, Mike. Hi, Geoff.
Aloha.
Morning, Vaughn.
Aloha, Vaughn. Glad to join you from the big island here in Hawaii today. And although BC politics just never seems that far away, I was just wondering, when was your first column on BC politics?
40 years ago next week.
Oh my
Wow.
gosh. Happy
Holy
anniversary.
That's
Thank
amazing.
you.
Oh, fantastic.
1984. January 1984. Bill Bennett was premier of British Columbia.
Did you go straight to 5 days a week?
Yes. Dave Barrett was still leader of the opposition, although the NDP had entered into the leadership race that picked Bob Skelly. And Barrett had been dragged out of the legislature chamber in the fall because part of the big solidarity standoff. So yeah.
What was your first column then about?
God, I don't know. It was 40 years ago. Funny. Oddly enough, I can remember some of the things I wrote as rock critic, but I can't remember my first column.
Geoff, were you at that 1984 NDP convention?
Not sure if I was there. I was certainly at the rally where Barrett spoke, but I think before that reference that Vaughn's making. But Barrett made a famous speech outside when the solidarity demonstration came to the legislature to inspire John Horgan to join the NDP.
Yeah.
So
there you go.
What's going on?
The 1984 NDP convention was one of the great ones. It was a delegate convention, so none of this damn nonsense of people voting online. There were 6 candidates and it ran 5 ballots. It was very, very exciting. Crossing the floor excitement, endorsing excitement, and it produced Bob Skelly, who was a very nice guy, but maybe not the best choice at the convention.
He was a compromise candidate, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Came up the middle.
Yeah, I probably should have picked Bill King, who was been the labor minister in the Barrett government, but there was a standoff, and Bill fell to 3rd place and had to drop, and then he had to choose, and he chose Skelly over Dave Vickers, who later went on to become a BC Supreme Court judge.
And wrote a transformative decision, the Chilcotin decision.
No, it was. Yeah.
We had Glenn Clark on just before Christmas.
Oh, yes.
And Glenn, aside from using me as a piñata during that interview, he talked a lot about class as a driver for his own politics, but as a clear demarcation point between the NDP and Free Enterprise parties. And that, I think, arguably was the case in the 1980s, but it seems like 40 years later now, maybe it's not as clear as that anymore. There's different fault lines. What fault lines do you see in BC politics these days?
Well, I think there's obviously urban-rural. And one of the big problems that BC United faced was that it lost all of its urban and suburban, most of its urban and suburban ridings where it had done well. I think there's something emerging around age demographics, one that's been around starting, and I think it explains why some of John Horgan's issues that he picked up, particularly pushing housing, campaigning to have childcare, which Adrian Dix had balked at. I think that those issues, line from which, Mike, you may remember better than I do, but it was told to me by somebody who was working for Christy Clark in the 2017 election, where she said to somebody, I'm the government sort of that'll get you a job. And the voters said, I've got a job, I can't afford a house. I think that's, if you look at EB's very ambitious housing plan, if you look at Adrian Dix, when he ran for premier in 2013, not pledge childcare because he said, he was persuaded the province could afford it. It was very much being, I think, one of the things that's now become everybody talks about it. So I think to some degree that's an age issue and an age demographic. It also is a sign of the growing power of the urban and suburban British Columbia. You don't have to go back too far. When I started covering the legislature in 1984, there were 57 seats in the House. They were still Metro Vancouver plus, say, Squamish to Chilliwack had only about half the seats in the House. That region was still not as politically powerful as it's become. As you know, every time they add seats to the legislature, they freeze the north and the interior, not counting the Okanagan. But no, it's changing demographic, changing population, but a province that is increasingly attuned to the agenda that's necessary to win Vancouver and its suburbs up to the Fraser Valley.
It's interesting. You've zeroed in on something we've come back to a lot, is this age and how age is kind of becoming this real cleaver. And it's an interplay of what you're naming. It's age. And then there's also the urban-rural divide is changing because of age and because of how age changes the affordability argument. Affordability always, right? Top of the political. Yeah. But then when housing kind of trumps everything else for one group, and almost is at odds sometimes actually with the economic interests of another group, it's kind of like it's this weird interplay of age, the cost of housing, and the geography that's also changing the sort of voter base in the burbs, right? I'm wondering, like, if you look at, I love that we're so close to your 40th anniversary. Is there a shift like that you can name that's happened over 40 years, or would that be one of the bigger ones looking back on it?
John Horgan choosing to not campaign in the North and the Interior in the 2017 election. It was interesting talking to Adrian Dix about this following the 2013 election and the reason why the New Democrats, under his leadership, had trouble winning parts of the Interior that had elected and helped elect Dave Barrett, and even helped elect Mike Harcourt and Glenn Clark. And, one of the things he said was, Vaughn, you have to realize those ridings, they used to have an IWA local that was a big part of the NDP's organizing resources and membership. They're gone. Like the change in the resource industries and resource industry jobs and communities has, I think, explained the NDP becoming a more urban, suburban party, and less the party that John Horgan's roots were in. David Eby's are not. And so that's in. The other division, I would say, is around the word diversity. It is. So again, sitting in the legislature in 2017, when they finally sorted out who was going to be the Premier of British Columbia, and John Horgan and his cabinet had taken their seats in the House. And I'm sitting there, as you know, the press gallery members actually sit in the chamber and look down on it. And we see them, right? And we see them partly because we want to catch the interplay. And the first thing that jumped out at me, and I remember talking to Keith Baldry of Global about it, was looking at the two sides. There was the John Horgan cabinet, gender balanced, representing the multicultural diversity of British Columbia. And there was the defeated now BC Liberals. They actually had one seat more than the NDP, but they were the old British Columbia. The party has had trouble as BC United still attracting the kind of candidates that reflect the diversity of the province. And the thing that the New Democrats did, that's an admirable, that diversity was not accomplished without risk and without paying a price. They lost nominations. They lost seats because the party was divided over their insistence that they were going to have an equity policy. I mean, okay, it's an old trade union party, right? Seniority rules, and a lot of NDP ridings had somebody who was sitting there who'd worked for the riding for years, and when the incumbent stepped down, it was their turn. And there were some very messy nomination fights over that. So, you'll hear BC Liberals and BC United scoff at the New Democrats with their equity policy. Well, the party did it. They paid a political price internally for it, but they ended up with a government that was far more representative of the diversity of British Columbia. And in terms of the goodness of the province, of being good for the province, I think that was a good thing.
Right. Well, I don't think it's any coincidence. There's two governments right now in Canada, I'd say in Ottawa and in Victoria, who have been the strongest supporters of childcare.
Yep.
They both have gender balance, the two with the gender balance cabinets.
Yeah.
Material change. I love that you've gone there, Vaughn, because we've had a lot of chat on this pod too about this shift, particularly in the front lines of politics. And some parties have navigated it better than others. But the front lines of politics are a lot less white, less male and less white than they were historically. And we've had some chats too, particularly with political staffers, saying, but there's this lagging part in the back room of folks who maybe don't reflect to the same degree the diversity. And then I want to take it back to journalism and say it's interesting because that would be another place where there's that lag. And again, a very kind of another layer for media in sort of the context now and the way the industry is struggling. But so I want to introduce this because when I think of, and one of the reasons I'm so pleased to meet you, Vaughn, is there are a handful of folks around Canada in capital cities, in the provinces and in Ottawa, like yourself, who have been covering politics for decades and decades and bring an asset I can't put any value on in terms of your experience, your knowledge, your ability to sort of cut through the noise and understand and bring a lot of memory and experience to your analysis of politics. And you're an endangered species. And I'm going to say most of you are old white men.
Yep, we sure are. Although I would point out that both of my predecessors as columnists in Victoria for the Vancouver Sun were women. Marjorie Nichols and Frances Russell. Marjorie did the job twice. And if there remain any politicians in British Columbia who think that I'm hard on politicians, they should have spent just one day in the shadow of a Marjorie Nichols column because she was ferocious. So I'm pretty forgiving compared to her. So, but you're right in general. You are right in general. They were unusual at their time. When you go up the stairs to the press Victoria, you can see it right from the top of the stairs where they're all with whiskers and bowler hats. The diversity is not reflected until the last few years, and now it is. But the problem there is, with journalism is there aren't nearly as many jobs as there used to be, and that's reality in our industry.
It is pretty remarkable the continuity in the BC press represented by yourself, Keith, Mike Smith, Les Lane, and Justine Hunter.
Yeah. The immortal Joy McPhail once remarked that the voters of British Columbia, in their wisdom, sometimes change the government, occasionally the opposition, but have never figured out how to change the press scout.
And pretty well every premier and government has complained about you on the way at some point in the term where you take a lot of flack for being 10
premiers
hurting
and
their
counting.
Feelings. Yeah.
10 premiers and counting. That's one every 4 years. It's just an average. It's not a prediction.
You touched on the situation in the gallery. Vaughn, what do you think is
Yeah.
to come, and how has the role of the gallery changed as the social media landscape's been transformed?
Well, I mean, the encouraging thing is there are a growing number of colleagues who cover the legislature and report on it in mediums that are not the traditional mediums. So the Tyee is what just marked its 20th anniversary. There's Orca, the very, I think, very good coverage coming from Northern Beat. And there are other publications really specializing in other kinds of coverage. People like Bob Mackin that are delivering an awful lot of content, in my view. So that's really encouraging, because that's the future, right? I mean, I continue to have 3 newspapers land on my doorstep every morning, which is kind of quaint and historic. It's a little like having antimacassars on your furniture. But the reality is, where it's headed, right? It is going to be increasingly online, increasingly digital. And I would note, too, all the evidence suggests that the younger generation, and true, everybody falls into that category when you're talking about me, but the younger generation overwhelmingly is getting their information from social media platforms that I barely understand. I'm not even able to name some of them. So that's where there is an enormous amount of information out there. That's a good thing. It's very easy to access information in ways that used to be very hard to do. You had to go to a library or dig into newsprint archives and things like that. Now it's all available. The only unfortunate thing about our time is that it is also a wonderful tool for spreading misinformation, which any of us can be guilty of, and really disturbing disinformation, which is deliberate and nasty and destructive, and there's way too much of it, but we all need to be on our guard against that.
Well, I love hearing your thread of hope, but I mean, I also feel like you must have noticed there's just fewer reporters when you're in the scrum.
Yeah,
there's just
absolutely.
like it's just a lower number, and I'd say more of them sort of cranking out copy at a high volume compared to the sort of, the folks who get to sit and bring thought and expertise and analysis. And
Yeah.
do you worry we're gonna, what's the cost of that? What's the long-term implication of that?
Well, I mean, my hope is that, and you're already seeing it, you're relying more heavily on what I would, a kind of a journalistic NGO, people that do analysis of government policy, that produce, I think, fairly thoughtful information. And we all end up quoting to them and going to them, whether you're talking think tanks or just individuals. This retired public servant, Richard McCandless, who keeps his eye on hydro and ICBC. And so there's all of those gaps being filled that way. The academic university community does the same thing. So that's what you're having to rely on. And it is what it is. I'm from 25 years ago, my friend Baldry was referring to the dying print sector when he left us and went to TV. TV is struggling. I worked for a cable company. I had an hour-long interview show on the cable company for 20 years, and the cable company gave up all of the public access channels. So, I worked for a long time, provided commentary for PBS and NPR in Seattle. I lost those gigs because they stopped doing it. So, but it is what it is, right? I mean, sit around and complain about it. It's like sitting around being the last Encyclopedia Britannica salesman in the world, saying they never imagined that anybody could produce something like that for free.
So in an earlier time, Vaughn, when maybe the global ratings were stronger, notwithstanding Keith's efforts, when the Vancouver Sun had 3 editions, when Rafe Mayer was patrolling talk radio, that kind of triple whammy would really drive provincial political news coverage, but also just the way governments behaved. How do you think, do governments behave differently now with the fragmentation? Do you see a difference?
Hugely.
Yeah.
Yeah, hugely. Again, the people who teach social studies in our schools and bring their classes here, a bunch of the social studies teachers show up in Victoria every fall, and they have a session with government and opposition, public service, and they have a session with the press gallery. And we were sitting talking to them this year. And one of my colleagues said, Les Lane, Victoria Times columnist, he said he goes into to write about a government policy announcement. And he said, he's Les Lane, he's one person. He's got all of the history and he's free to say what he thinks, and he's got the Times columnist as a platform. He said he increasingly has a sense that there's this vast force of communications on the government side, if it's a government announcement, that he's up against, because government communications, the last time I checked, is still staff of between 250 and 300 people. And a massive amount of their effort goes into social media, not buying ads in traditional media. And so there's not I think you're right. There was a different balance in the 1990s when most people got most of their information about the government from a fairly small number of news organizations. BCTV at its peak was about 50% of the audience, and 50% management efforts went into trying to deal with the message on BCTV. And you're right, talk radio was bigger. The Sun and Province and Times columnist and Globe and Mail circulations combined were bigger. Radio was bigger, and the other ways that people get information barely existed. Social media platforms, podcasts, online news services, and all that. That's true, and everybody's trying to adjust to it. But it's, again, as I said, it is what it is. It's I'm very lucky that I lived through a period where established traditional media had more influence and all that was great. And I had a lot more colleagues at the Vancouver Sun writing stories and researching stuff and publishing it. Okay, fine. I'm sorry, you can't sell encyclopedias door to door anymore. It turns out there's an alternative.
Well, I think it makes it harder for oppositions to inflict damage through earned media. We can see through Poilievre's developed his own channels to just go directly to people and inflict damage that way, which seems to be working on it federally. But provincially, the opposition here, interesting your view, whether it's the mediums they're trying to use, or whether it's their tactics, or whether it's they're just too old and not with the times. I don't know. What do you think of this opposition?
I feel like Vaughn's reacting really strongly. For anyone not watching on YouTube, his facial expression, there's a strong reaction here. I'm guessing it comes back to the ability to inflict damage through earned media, but sorry, just watch on YouTube if you're not.
I think Mike, you've pointed out that the world has changed, and the media landscape has changed, and the way you communicate has changed. But the government has always had more resources than the opposition parties. And the government has always been able, because it's the government and what it says actually gets done, has always had the edge on reporting. But you're pointing out that Poilievre, as an opposition leader, has figured out how to get attention and communicate and get his message out there and put the government on the defensive. So it's, just because everything has changed, it doesn't mean that a clever, well thought out, well-led opposition can't put the government on the defensive. So the question is not, gee, isn't it too bad that opposition parties can't get earned media? The question is, what's wrong with the opposition in British Columbia?
We're gonna stick on the opposition, but I want to tuck into that with a bit of a follow question about how how this changing media landscape changes what the discussion is, right? So what's the story that has legs? What's the thing that's how long something stays in the public narrative, right? Do you see, is that one of the shifts that has changed from when it was, say, mostly print and TV and radio to when it's social media is actually shaping some of that?
Well, I would say here in British Columbia, under this government, most of the coverage and most of the discussion has been on substantive policy issues. You have an activist government that came in with an activist agenda and proceeded to implement it, and on balance, did fairly well. We're not. The NDP government in the 90s and the Socred government that I covered, an awful lot of the coverage there was scandals, incompetence, and ministers who had to go. You know, the Van der Zalm government, I think, broke the record for 12 ministers who had to step down. One of the things that was remarkable about the nasty showdown over the government's plan for the provincial museum was it was unique. It only lasted a month. It was a total fiasco. But the premier stepped in and ended it. I mean, you go back and there hasn't been a serious scandal of the type that plagued Christy Clark or Bill Van der Zalm, Glenn Clark, Mike Harcourt. So I think we've had mostly substantive discussion of housing policy, drug decriminalization, crime in the streets, bail reform. It's been a fairly substantive discussion. It's happening in different news media, but I can look elsewhere, and our friends south of the border, and see a transformation. But I would say, on the whole, BC Hydro Site C. There's a serious discussion about whether or not build that dam or not, and another serious discussion as to whether or not to cancel it, LNG, carbon taxation. These are major, major issues, but they're being discussed at a fairly major, substantive, serious level in this province as well.
Yet there is a paradox, though, where if you ask people in a poll today, are you happy with what the government's doing on affordability? They would net negative. Healthcare, net negative. Crime on the streets, lots of public concern, especially voiced by NDP mayors like Leonard Krogh. BC Ferry Service, definitely a problem. So despite all these underlying problems on issues and policies, Premier's approval ratings are pretty robust. The opposition parties can't touch them in the polls. So, I'll grant you that there are some issues where they probably are getting good marks. I think on climate, they're pulling their weight in terms of the politics on it. But, there is this kind of like, well, if the number one issue in the polls is affordability all the time, and they're not seen to be doing a very good job on it, and people are concerned about it, they're not paying a political price for it.
It must be nirvana for a politician to look at an opinion poll where people say, and they've said this repeatedly, the big 3 or 4 issues of our time are these, and we don't think you're doing a very good job on it. In some cases, we think you're doing a rotten job on it. And by the way, if an election is held tomorrow, we're still going to re-elect you. That is a paradox. And that is, I've covered a number of premiers who wouldn't have believed that it was possible. And so it's incredible how that's happened. I can guess at 2 or 3 reasons for it, but it's just a guess because we don't have that kind of polling. It's people crediting the previous premier and the current one with good intentions, believing that they're working on it and they're serious about it. It's people looking at the alternatives and going, I don't think this guy's got answers to anything. That's the opposition. And maybe it's an awareness of just how hard it is to fix these problems. I mean, if you think of the challenge in the healthcare system and people without family doctors, you think of housing affordability. Everything that's been done, it's still even less affordable than ever. Drug decriminalization and crime. Maybe it's everybody is going, it's going to take a hell of a lot of effort to fix these problems, and I'm not sure throwing these guys out and putting the other guys in is going to do it. But that's guessing. I really don't know the answer to that. I do think it's true. The polls keep telling the same story, which is we're not really all that impressed with the job the government's doing, but we still vote for them given a chance.
How much do you think, how much in the sort of possibilities you contemplate, did you go to sort of the strength of the government and their leadership versus the absence and the sort of disarray in the other parties? and let's just say,
I can't resist. Look, the best line about the last BC Liberal government was given by Bill Bennett, not the former premier, but the one who was a cabinet minister. And he said partway through the last term of the Liberals, Christy Clark's leadership, and he was a supporter of it, he said the idea that we can't lose the next election is far more dangerous than the idea that we couldn't win the last one. So I'm sitting there with a couple of colleagues in the summer of 2017, and whoever was the John Horgan minister in charge is announcing $1.5 million to pay the higher education fees of people who've managed to, in older age, get themselves through high school and now want to get training. And it's $1.5 million. And the government, according to the audited financial statements, was sitting on something like $1 billion and $1.5 billion in cash. They ran for office with $1 billion in the bank, and they picked a fight with the disabled over their bus passes. I mean, they lost power because they got arrogant and complacent and smug and incompetent. They didn't accept it. I was at an event with a staffer in that last Liberal government a few months after the election, and he said his colleagues in the government were insistent that they not say they lost the election. And he said, I say to them, I think we lost. I'm out of a job, They wasted the next 3 years in denial. Their own postmortem on the 2020 election is an entertaining read because it's such a devastating evisceration of them. And what else can I say? They changed their name.
Stop there.
Mike says more, please. More, please.
Get me warmed up.
Well, I would just add to your diagnosis, which I won't quibble with, is governmentitis. And I think over time,
that's a good word.
As governments age, they become too deferential, not blaming the public servants here, but they've become too deferential to the rationales that emerge from the bureaucracy, why you can't do something. And I know in that particular case you were referencing on children in care and free tuition, I was very familiar with that issue. It was championed by Ralph Nilsson, who was president of Vancouver Island University, who was a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine. And I thought it should have been in the platform. I thought and they just couldn't get it done. And I'm not blaming anybody other than it's just an example of something that would have been easy to do financially. And somebody had a reason why it couldn't happen.
But while we're talking about money, I'd just like to, sorry, Mike, finish up on that.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Geoff.
Well, my own view is, well, and you may disagree with it, is that the elimination of big money in politics, which was a commitment of the incoming government I worked for, has had an even more dramatic change than those who championed it thought it would. In my view, it was a huge factor in BC politics, and now is gone. And I don't know what your take is on that, but I think that was a cloud that hung over the previous government. It was a cloud that hung over the civic government that I was a member of. And I just wonder what your take is on it.
Well, I agree with you that it has dramatically changed things, because among the things that the BC Liberals never adjusted to, apart from losing the election and not reflecting the diversity of the province, was they never recovered from the loss of the staggering amounts of money they were pulling in from big cash donors. And again, political parties have had to adjust to that over the years, and they've done it in different ways. But only now are they starting to catch up to the NDP. They changed their name in April. And in November, they said, you know what, we've created a fund for rebranding, and it's empty. There's no money in it. I mean, these guys are supposed to be plugged into the business community. Ask anybody in the business community, you're rebranding? You better have a couple of $1 million ready to go out and tell people you've done it, right? But on the money thing, yes. The money thing made it very, very easy to run big spending election campaigns without worrying too much about having to appeal to a whole bunch of members where you got your money from. So that was big. But look, the other thing is, hey, they lost their legislative majority by 200 votes. Mm-hmm. That's how close it was. Anybody tells you it doesn't matter if you vote in British Columbia. I always used to mention the case of Al Passerelle, who won his seat by one vote in 1979. And his opponent, who lost, remembered that he and his wife hadn't voted. But the classic is Comox in 2017. Man, it was that close. And I remember talking to Mike McDonald during that campaign. I guess it was probably off the record, but I do remember him. We were running down the list of 10 seats ever that changed hands would deliver power to the NDP by one seat. And I remember you expressing a fair amount of doubt about whether or not those were in the bag. I will point out, however, Geoff, that the NDP premier, a leader who had the best record raising giant amounts of money from people who would write $10,000 checks, was Adrian Dix.
Mm-hmm. And the expectation of victory.
For all the good it did him.
Yeah.
Well, money doesn't everything.
True.
Well, as we've talked several times on this show, I'm still waiting for a more magnanimous thank you from the NDP for the amount of money that was left to them by the Christy Clark government.
It was incredible.
Make no apologies for the running a strong public purse and the strong fundamentals of government. Anyways, but a serious point on that is that I kind of view the era here, Vaughn, as say 1991 to 2017, where there was a realignment in BC politics.
Mm-hmm.
The BC Liberals emerged, and the unifying message for that coalition was fiscal discipline and economic growth. And that's really what kept it together. And I think what's changed, especially with accelerated by COVID, is that the fiscal discipline message is just not something that, in fact, even seems a negative based on what happened in 2017, but is not something that floats people's boats as much. And as you mentioned earlier, what's good's a strong economy if you can't afford your house? So, it seems like that's up in the air for free enterprise right now, is what are those forces that can pull together 40% of the vote. And that's obviously with a fragmented opposition, it's very unclear how that's going to happen.
Well, I think there needs to be some acknowledgement that this government's economic record, by the metrics that the Liberals used to cite when they were government, are pretty good. Jobs numbers are good. Debt numbers relative to the rest of the country are good. They managed to produce a $6 billion surplus in the wake of the pandemic, to their own astonishment and everybody else. The BC economy is still strong and delivering the goods. It's still diversified. And, and I think, like we see this week, the ICBA, which is not an organization that's noted for putting out press releases that are flattering to the government, reported today that 87% of its members think that the construction sector is going to be as good or better next year in 2024. So, I think running on an old agenda that had a lot of validity, particularly in the 1990s, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you go out and look at, and increasingly they are, right? The government's vulnerable on the issues you've mentioned. Not having a family doctor, unsafe streets, open drug use, put all that together again. They are pushing those issues. They're raising them. And maybe that's where the difficulty as an opposition party in earning media is true. But again, I would point out, Poilievre seems to have figured out how to do it. Maybe he's just a better communicator.
So on that note, actually, Vaughn, I'd love to, if you would join us for our first ever pod crossover.
Whatever.
Yeah, it's like cheers. We'd like to show you a clip actually from our sister podcast, The Curse of Politics. And I bring it up because the person who we want to refer to actually is Corey Tenike, former Stephen Harper staffer, talking about actually taking a look at BC.
All right. Surprise politician to watch in 2024. Corey, who's your pick?
John Rustad, the BC Conservative leader. Somebody that not a lot of folks know, with a party that has, we've seen iterations of, but I encourage everyone to listen to Hotel Pacifico, the sister podcast on BC politics. It's a part of the air quotes media network, but there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in BC, and I think he's driving it. And so I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit more about the guy over the coming year, because I think he's got momentum, and that's interesting to watch.
He's leading a realignment, you think?
Yeah, I think so. But there's been a bit of a vacuum. The rebranding of the BC Liberals has maybe not gone as perfectly as people would have liked. But I think there's probably some leadership issues there too. It's maybe less the party label and more about why is it that you're running? What is it that your offering is? What is it that is the problem with the existing government? What is it that is your solution? The kind of framing that you're seeing Poilievre do effectively, and that any opposition party that wants to become the government has to go through. You're just not seeing happening within the BC Liberals right now. So I kind of feel interested to see whether Falcone gets his mojo back or finds it in the first place, and whether or not Rustad and the BC Conservatives are actually able to put something together.
There you go, Vaughn. So what do you think? Is Rustad leading a realignment? Yeah.
Fair. I mean, that's a fair comment. First of all, he's done very well, and he hasn't been leader yet for quite a full year yet. He's done very well. He's shown that he's fairly quick to take stands that are in line with public opinion. I mean, he jumped in on that court decision at the end of the year and immediately said, well, if the judge thinks that it violates the rights of drug takers to be denied the right to take drugs within 15 meters of a playground or 6 meters of a bus stop, if I'm in government, I'll bring in and use the notwithstanding clause. So that sort of shocks the traditional political legal establishment in the country, but it is the kind of thing that one might expect from Pierre Poilievre if the occasion arose, right? I mean, the standard BC United line is, well, he's just surfing the wave created by Pierre Poilievre. Well, there's some truth to that, but he's also taking the same kinds of positions, right? He's going to get rid of the carbon tax as well. He's doing the same populist, contrary thing. So, I think you say, well, it's fine if the election rolls around and he's the guy who's talking the same as and sounds the most like Pierre Poilievre. He might well get some of Poilievre's votes. Rustad is, I will say this, he's still a relatively unknown commodity, even though he's been in the legislature for a long time. He'd never had much of a profile as a cabinet minister and all that. So, we don't know how much of a presence he's going to have. He says he's going to nominate candidates all over the province. He needs an organization. He's not raising much money yet. So he's still got a long way to go. But the amazing thing is he's gone from taking a party from nowhere to second place in the polls. Yes, a long way behind the NDP, but second place. There's been some apprehension among New Democrats about how far Rustad could go. New Democrats of a certain age remember the 1991 election in British Columbia, where Mike Harcourt and the New Democrats had the win in the bag. And in mid-campaign, you had a sudden emergence of Gordon Wilson and the Liberals, and they surged, and briefly, if the election had been called on that day, might have formed a government. And that all happened in about 10 days.
God help us.
And it would have been fabulous. So it would have just been a wonderful government to cover. And there's if New Democrats who were around then go, well, don't say it can't happen in this province, right? We've had populist forces in the province surge, flash fairly quickly, and for a fairly short period of time do well. And I think that's why some of the people in the NDP, not the ones who have David Eby's ear all that closely, were saying, well, why don't we go early? Why do you keep saying you're not going to call an early election? Why don't you call an early election, catch everybody with the pants down, and win another term? Now, Eby, to his credit, has said, I'm not going to do that, and I don't think he is going to do it. But yeah, I think keep an eye on Rustad. I would say at the moment he's no Pierre Poilievre, but then I would say that about Kevin Falcon as well.
I think Rustad has the advantage. I call it the Jordan Bateman advantage, because during the transit referendum, whenever that was, 2014, 2015, around there, Jordan would, in his bedroom slippers and house coat, eviscerate the pro side, by just calling the radio station and going on the media without having to process it through 100 different, cooks in the kitchen.
Good point.
Whereas when you have a large caucus, or even a caucus size BC United has, it's harder to move quickly, or you have to find the processes to move quickly. So Rustad can, as soon as the thought pops in his head, he can go straight to the media and get coverage. So
yeah, that's true. And you can talk yourself
into a large caucus.
You can talk yourself into some serious trouble doing that too, if you pick an issue that it doesn't ring true with the public or sounds wrong with the public. Yeah. It's interesting to hear the premier on John Rustad, because you'd think a New Democrat's reaction would be to just, I don't agree with him, and shut up and welcome his presence. But Eby actually says regularly that he thinks that Rustad and the Conservatives present some kind of a threat to BC unity, the province's unity, and to the kind of political fabric of British Columbia. The premier has made a number of denunciations of Rustad now that suggest he finds him a fairly disturbing presence in our political arena.
Do you think he's just saying that because he's just saying that, or do you think they're trying to poison the well, that if Rustad and Falcon come to some understanding and put the Humpty Dumpty back together again, that Eby's laying some groundwork to say, see, this guy's so extreme, try to drive the moderates away from.
You know, I think if David Eby were that cynical, he would never have ruled out an early election, and he would have called one by now. I actually don't think that he's guided by cynicism on this issue. I think he's a serious person. I don't particularly agree with him that Rustad poses that threat to the, political and intellectual well-being of British Columbia, but I think the Premier's serious what he says about him.
What's going to happen then? Like, I think picking up on Mike's point, and going back to why the Clark government sat on so much money and this unifying power of fiscal prudence. And now we have the Cleave, and now we have sort of, Rustad, I think he is channeling a Polyev type line, and then also picking up on places like a Fire Bonnie Henry line that just doesn't, there's people within BC United so what's the realignment that happens here? Like where is this going in terms of how you can unify, if you're Kevin Falcon, like how you can unify that group?
It's a huge challenge. I mean, first of all, there's personal ego, and it's bad between those two for obvious reasons. And Gordon Campbell's combination was, we are not going to be a socially conservative party. And if I hear one of you ever mention any restrictions on abortion, you will go nowhere fast. And interesting enough, that silenced Rich Coleman for 16 incredible years. So Campbell just made it clear that we're not going there. We are, as Mike McDonald described it, fiscally conservative management, economic growth. The thing that I think the understated challenge facing Falcon at the moment and BC United, that the New Democrats have not, their metrics are good. The share of gross domestic product that is debt in British Columbia is still low. They inherited good numbers on debt and deficits and operating, and they paid off debt and all sorts of things. The interest rates are low. Spending, they've massively increased the size of the public service and massively increased government spending and borrowing, and yet the metrics are still good because it's a strong province, a wealthy province. Liberals left an awful lot of money behind, it's true, but it's very hard to put together a case that this government is damaged the economy and reckless fiscally. It was easy to do that in the 90s.
What about the climate issue where Rustad was sent packing on the climate question? Yes. Now Kevin Falcon's had to scramble to the side of those who are very concerned about the carbon tax, and Eby has said he will stay the course. So is it going to be a vote determining thing? Is this going to reshape the election, do you think?
Well, I think Rustad has put it well himself that he's amused that he was kicked out of the caucus for saying the kind of things that Falcon now hints at. I think that we went through it. We had an election here that was fought on a climate action plan and the carbon tax, and the New Democrats opposed it, and they lost the election, and that was the end of it. It wasn't even an issue for several elections after that. It's come back, partly because it's now a national issue. I think because the cost of living became an issue and people started going, what am I paying for? It became an issue as people became more aware that, they're paying more here, but we're not the ones that are going to have the impact in the long run on this. So Eby has stubbornly insisted, alone really now among even national NDP politicians, that we're not budging on this at all. I mean, he had the opportunity on home heating. He's had the opportunity of capping the carbon tax. It's not happening. Okay. So he runs the risk, because the tax is going up again on April the 1st, of running up against the affordability issue. I think he recognized that a while ago, because as you will remember, toward the end of the year, when he was asked about the carbon tax and affordability, he said, we offset that with rebates, which they do, and we're looking at some kind of a rebate from BC Hydro. So I think his answer before April the 1st, when the tax goes up again, is going to be that there will be cash back for a significant number of British Columbians, and that will be his answer. I think he recognizes there's an issue with the carbon tax. He just isn't going to deal with it by changing the carbon tax. He's going to deal with it by offsets, economic ones, elsewhere. Problem with hydro, of course, is that hydro is not doing all that well.
Yeah.
This is going to be a challenge. I'm sure they're
Not
having
enough snow.
Well, yeah, and so they're buying power, $1 billion worth of power from outside British Columbia, and but you can. Successive BC governments have discovered that you can order BC Hydro to do things and order the BC Utilities Commission to approve it, and I assume that's what's going to happen. Much as they deplore doing that in opposition.
Yeah, I mean, there's a cocktail of issues there. You mentioned the
a few, yes.
20% of the hydro's power being imported because with drought conditions taking place. BC came up with an analysis that showed pretty significant economic consequences of the Clean BC plan, which the Premier hotly disputes.
Yes.
As well, there's Glenn Clark on our episode in December opposed the carbon tax, saying that it's borne by the working people, and he doesn't see that as he's a lone NDP voice on that. But it seems like there's a lot going on in these issues,
yes.
right? And perhaps there's an opportunity, if it's cloaked in affordability, the opposition can take that and put it in a way that people can understand. But it's complicated stuff, so it's hard to kind of get the voters' head around it too, I think.
Yeah, but I do think that the one of the changes in the last year and a half, and even here in British Columbia, has been the carbon tax has gone from being really a non-issue to being a significant matter of contention around the affordability issue, and the government has chosen to stick with the tax, but is looking at ways to offset the impact with relief and so forth. And they already, we asked them for the numbers a while ago. So they collect $3 billion in carbon taxes, and they give back about $750 million in cash rebates of one kind or another. Although, here's the problem with them. You get it back in your income taxes. And it's not like the government's sending you a check. It reduces your taxes, but someone said this about this, looking at it. If your government, you want to give people something, eliminating the tolls on a bridge is very effective because you don't actually pay them anymore. And it's not coming off, you're not having to pay it every day as you were having to when you cross the bridge. And if you give a cash rebate from a Crown Corporation or ICBC or anything, and you get a check, well, that's real. But some of this stuff is done through the income tax system. And, you sit down and you do your taxes, you still have to pay your taxes. You're paying less than, if you didn't have the rebate, but it isn't, or the tax credit. A tax credit is not as effective a way of offsetting the pain at the pump as actually reducing the pain at the pump.
It's not very visible. Is there is there anything you can see, as we move towards October? Is there any kind of sleeping bear or anything you can see really tripping this government up and disrupting these fantastic, generous poll numbers they're experiencing?
Sure. I still have hidden away somewhere all of the columns I wrote about Premier Adrian Dix, and his opinion polls showed that he was headed for a majority 48 hours before the election. So, yeah, of course, there's a whole bunch of the electorate that don't even turn their mind to the issue of an election until the election's underway. There are a whole bunch of areas out there where people are dissatisfied with the government. And if you could put together a plausible alternative, well led, that said, elect us and we'll fix this, that opportunity's there. There's plenty of time to turn stuff around. As I said, I covered a British Columbia election that almost turned against Mike Harcourt in a matter of days. And he went on to win a good majority. But yeah, so yes, it can happen. However, you know, the odds, say David Eby may not be the winner of the next election, but that's the way to bet. You've referred to it a number of times. You've got a divided opposition. It's not easy to see how to put this thing together. So, you know, as you, like McDonald knows the history of the province better than I do, you'll know there, and Geoff I'm sure does too, that every now and then in British Columbia, the non-NDP party in the province, and this has been around since the non-NDP parties in the province, since the CCF came along, they fall apart or almost lose an election, and they have to reorganize themselves. And sometimes, once, they manage to do that within just a 3-year period in opposition. Sometimes it takes longer for them to put the egos aside, reach a consensus on who should be the vehicle. Sometimes you get a little help from the voters in that, but it doesn't just happen. And it's very difficult to negotiate while you're in opposition, because opposition leaders have very little power, reward, or do anything else. And in this case, you've got struggle raising money and all sorts of other things as well. So if they can't reach a consensus among themselves, and I don't see how they will at this point, because they're both nominating candidates, right? So how do you agree on one candidate in each riding, which would be the way to combine the vote? Mm-hmm. And maybe the voters, you know, this is where New Democrats are going. The guy you want to watch is Rustad. You know, maybe what's the chance? Well, it's not out of the question. He may do it. I think there was some speculation that Falcon would somehow or other fall on his own sword and that, but that's not. He's invested a huge amount of his life in this. He's not going to pass on it without one shot at the job. He's been fighting this job since he was Christy Clark's rival in student politics at SFU, right? They're both.
I think they're on the same side in student politics at SFU, just for the record.
It was interesting, that great interview she gave when she was working in radio, right? That politics was like the old boyfriend. And, you know, you sit down, you're having a couple of drinks and you phone him up and you go, I got to get back into this. And she did. She had a fabulous job on the radio. Why the hell did she go back into politics? Well, because she loved it and she became Premier of British Columbia, much to my surprise, as you would no doubt remind me.
Yes, I will again.
I believe you still have a framed copy of the column that I wrote saying you were incompetent and should be fired, which was written about 3 months before you won the election.
I think you said I was not up to the job.
But I was more generous than you.
It is somewhere in my archives. So looking ahead, Vaughn, who do you see as the political up-and-comers?
They're, you know, this is part of the problem, is they're mostly, part of the problem for the opposition is they're mostly on the government side, right? Obviously, the deputy premier and housing minister, Owen Ma, very ambitious. I don't think the EB cabinet at this point is as strong as the first Horgan cabinet, but there's lots of promising faces and unproven ones. Their backbench is still not all that well known. Eleanor Sturko is obviously a political phenomenon. She's only been in the legislature for a little over a year, and she's already getting more attention, and deservedly so, than most of the BC Liberals combined. Rumors abound that yes, I know I called them that, and I need to put another $1 in my penalty jar for that. I think the rumors abound that Poilievre is probably going to persuade Ellis Ross to run federally for the Conservatives. He's a very impressive figure to me, Indigenous leader, business leader. And I think he would be a real prize for the federal Conservatives, or whether he'll do it or not, I don't know. You're seeing there's a bunch of BC United MLAs that have announced they're not running again. I mean, you look at that and go, these are members who've been in the legislature for a while, but they've never been at the cabinet table. And are they sitting down and going, I don't want to spend another 4 years in opposition, right? Like, I think that's kind of telling in a way.
Well, I think they have to affect as we talked about at the outset of this episode today, they have to deal with the age issue. They need to get some younger blood in winnable seats, and one example would be Mike Morris retiring and Kyle Giddens, a younger replacement, coming in and contending for that seat, and someone with some political experience could offer
that's a good point.
So they need to do that in other places too, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Well,
Do you see anybody at the municipal level that's caught your eye?
Oh, everybody sees Brad West.
Yeah.
And I think he ran for another term as mayor because Farnworth had already indicated he was going to run for one more term as MLA. And I mean, that would be the seat that's the POCO seat. So West is a political phenomenon. His ability to say the right thing that is going to appeal to the electorate, and they're going to say, you know what, that guy makes a lot of sense. He does it all the time.
It'd be a major headache for David Eby, though, if he was in the caucus.
Well, maybe he'll be a candidate for the leadership the next time it's open.
Who knows? Well, Vaughn, we really appreciate your insights today. It's an honor to have you on our pod, and we're going to head off to the mini bar. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. Come to the mini bar.
Yeah, it's certainly a pleasure to talk to you. And in my absence, without a drink in my hand except a glass of water, I will give a toast to British Columbia's politicians, and who have been extremely generous over the years in terms of raw material for writing political columns. I'm forever in their debt, all of them. And I think this is an appropriate place to remind you of the immortal words of a cabinet minister, Socred era, who was in the cabinet and said to the reporters in the media scrum, I want the people of British Columbia to know that I am not innocent of anything. He spoke for many of our politicians collectively.
About 5 years ago, we started a Christmas tradition in my house where there's a gift under the tree that's about doing good. We started simple by sponsoring an endangered animal. And even then, I was still a little worried that my then 3- and 6-year-olds would throw tantrums and demand a Hatchimal or a Tickle Me Elmo. Thankfully, they didn't. They got it. And ever since, we've leaned in a little bit more each year to finding new ways to do good. Presenting sponsor TELUS does this year-round with their TELUS Connecting for Good and TELUS Wise programs, which improve access and connectivity for those who need it most and helps empower people to stay safe online. There are 5 streams. Mobility for Good provides free or low-cost pre-loved cell phones and plans for youth emerging from foster care, low-income seniors, government-assisted refugees, and Indigenous women at risk of violence. Internet for Good provides low-cost connectivity for in-need families, people with disabilities, low-income seniors, youth aging out of care, and government-assisted refugees. Tech for Good provides customized training and assistive technology for people with disabilities who face barriers using wireless devices, laptops, and computers. Health for Good provides marginalized individuals with improved access to primary and mental health services. And finally, Palace Wise offers free workshops and digital literacy education to individuals of all ages, covering topics like identity theft, cyberbullying, digital well-being, AI ethics, and more. Since the inception of TELUS's Connecting for Good and TELUS's WISE programs, TELUS has provided support for 165,000 individuals across British Columbia. To learn more about these programs, visit telus.com/connectingcanada. It's not a Hatchimal, but even Elmo would be tickled by that.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
Back to the minibar after the holiday season. So much for dry January. I guess it's just politically, so I think we'll be okay. I'll start. I wanted to take a shot at the mayor of Langley Township. He was in the news this week. I don't know if you saw this about the vigilante dads who actually, went around. I think there were a series of thefts in Langley Township. And this group of dads sort of went around trying to trying to find a thief. And there was a Facebook group where they actually they post a video when they actually catch someone who was in a flower shop and get congratulated as vigilante dads. And obviously this kind of ends up being a bit divisive with some people sort of saying, vigilantism isn't exactly something we should be celebrating. And I want to take a shot at Township Mayor Eric Woodward, who I'm taking a shot at him because, from what I can tell, this is someone who does have some political aspirations, some view towards continuing his political career. And I'm just going to say, stop liking things on Facebook. If you have any aspirations in politics, the risk reward balance is just not there. You can be on Facebook if you have to. I can talk about some stories about why that might not totally work, but you can be there. Just stop liking things, because all you're doing is throwing fodder for future Oppo researchers who are just going to have a field day. So stop it. Don't do it. That's my shot.
Okay.
Sure.
Geoff, want to go?
Sure. I've got a name that won't be familiar to anybody. It wasn't to me, but I still want to raise a glass to Satish Kumar, who is one of the leaders of the Hindu temple in Surrey. It's called Lakshmi Narayan Mandir. They had a community meeting on the weekend that had 800 people turn out. They had at least 7 NDP MLAs. I'm sure they had a number of BC United MLAs. They'd already talked to conservative leaders and so forth. They had some MPs, and the topic was this strange story that broke out in November in Surrey, White Rock, Abbotsford, of extortion letters being delivered to independent businessmen, South Asian business people. And Mr. Kumar's own son had, between Christmas and New Year's, had his door riddled with 27 bullets. So I raise a glass to him, because in the context of that kind of criminal activity, which apparently is reaching as far as Brantford, and has been a problem in Edmonton recently too, it's great to see a community leader take public responsibility for leading the outcry against this, because I think it's going to be one of the most effective tools. And Attorney General Nikki Sharma turned up at that meeting and promised that the government would continue to take action, which Mike Farworth has been saying he will do as well. So it was a very broad political thing, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it become an issue in the upcoming election. But congratulations to Mr. Kumar and his community for taking a public stand against a very worrisome development.
Thanks, Geoff. I'm going to raise a glass to BC's new Chief Justice, Len Marchand, who was appointed, I think, since our last episode, or in the last few weeks anyways. Mm. He's also BC's first Indigenous Chief Justice. He has a fairly impressive legal career coming from Kamloops, and his father was the first First Nations member of Parliament from British Columbia, and was a force in his own right. But the new Chief Justice has his own career and his own accomplishments separate from his father, but a family that's contributed a lot to British Columbia and Canada, and I wish him well on his new duties. And there was a good profile in the Vancouver Sun on him and what he's hoping to do with his responsibilities on the bench. So good luck, and hopefully I won't be appearing before him anytime soon. That's a wrap for today. Kate, you want to bring it home?
Yeah, that's it for our stay this week. First day after the holidays and in the new year, 2024. I guess we got to thank Vaughn for joining us today, and thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, for making Hotel Pacifico possible. We'll see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.